chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have any philosophical objection to supporting our allies. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are still America's allies. But what I object to, and what many of us in Congress object to, is the bypassing of Congress in selling arms to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. On May 24th, the Trump administration, through Secretary Pompeo, notified Congress that it was declaring a fake emergency to bypass congressional review of 22 arms sales to Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. How do we know this is a fake emergency? Because there is no emergency to the United States or to UAE or to Saudi Arabia regarding the war in Yemen. It is a horrific humanitarian problem. The Saudi-led coalition has killed countless civilians, but it is not an emergency that would justify weapons sales to Saudi Arabia and UAE that bypasses congressional procedure. And in fact, it's been recently reported that the UAE is now pulling its troops out of Yemen. What kind of emergency is this that would require the bypass of Congress to sell arms to UAE and Saudi Arabia? In addition, we had a hearing in the Foreign Affairs Committee where the Trump administration official admitted that many of these arms would not even be ready for months, if not years, in order to be sold. So it is unacceptable that the administration is trying to bypass Congress. And what this amendment will do is simply say you cannot declare a fake emergency to bypass Congress to sell these arms. If you want to sell these arms to Saudi Arabia and UAE, you have to do them through the normal process. And I request I vote on this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For purposes, gentleman from New York seek recognition.
Mr. Chair, I rise to claim the time in opposition.
Gentleman is recognized.
I rise in opposition to this amendment, which would prohibit any funds from being used to process any arms sales or transfers to Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates pursuant to an emergency certification made under the Arms Export Control Act. The President's emergency certification of May 24th to move 22 arms sales as an emergency was to address increased threats from Iran to U.S. security interests and Iran's continued efforts to destabilize the region, which directly impacts our strategic allies. The Democrat majority had been holding on to arms sales through congressional notification requirements and abusing oversight power with the Arms Export Control Act. Some of these requests by the administration had been on hold for over a year, and there was no progress in determining why. We witnessed just last month, on June 19th, Iran shot down a U.S. military asset, a drone over international waters, one of many examples of Iranian aggression targeting the United States and other nations, many in that region surrounding Iran. There's no doubt that Iran is an increased threat. I urge members to oppose this amendment. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California.
Thank you. I yield 2 minutes to Representative David Cicilline.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman for yielding and rise in strong support of the Lieu amendment and co-sponsor of this amendment, which will prevent the sale of weapons to the Gulf without undergoing the proper congressional notification process. This administration has invented an emergency in the Middle East in order to circumvent the process of congressional review over arms sales, an egregious and legally questionable move to put more weapons in the hands of the regimes who are responsible for perpetrating horrific civilian casualties in Yemen, often with U.S. weapons. The administration briefed this body on Iran just days before the supposed emergency was declared, yet never mentioned anything at the time about an emergency. The administration claims that Iran poses such an imminent threat to our allies that emergency assistance is needed for Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to defend themselves. Yet most of these weapons are offensive weapons, and much of the sale will be delivered months or years from now. The logic doesn't make sense because there is no logic. This is an administration that has cozied up to Riyadh, sweeping aside gross human rights abuses, turning a blind eye to the Saudis taking a buzzsaw to a Washington Post reporter, and supporting an intervention in Yemen that is causing famine, destruction, and mounting loss of life. Just because you don't like the process doesn't mean you get to ignore it. This action has implications far beyond this current sale, and if Congress doesn't reassert our proper role in the process, we risk giving up our authority in the arms sale process entirely. I strongly urge my colleagues to support this excellent amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to point out, Chairman Engel has been approaching this issue a little more of a surgical approach and looking at federal law. I think that would be the more appropriate tactic in being able to work together in bipartisan fashion on this issue. This amendment, with all due respect to my good friend from California, is a little more of a sledgehammer. I'd probably say that would be true unapologetically. I, though, would certainly encourage my colleagues, really on both sides of the aisle, to be able to work together through concerns that others may have, rather than passing this particular amendment. There has been a hold that's been placed for a very long time, and I would also encourage any members of Congress who are responsible for that hold or support the hold to articulate to us and to the administration exactly what the hold is, the concerns are, and how we can work through it together. I hope that we all are in unanimity with concern over Iranian aggression in the Middle East. We all are in unanimity concerned when we see Iran beyond the rhetorical calling us the great Satan, pledging death to America, building a land bridge across the Middle East, supporting Assad in Syria and financing Hezbollah in Lebanon, and certainly the concerns with the movement in shipping lanes around Yemen, a conflict that the Houthis, in overthrowing a legitimate government, did with the backing of the Iranians. So there are a lot of concerns that we have on our side of the aisle as it relates to Iranian aggression, and I hope that we can work together in dealing with those concerns that we all have as it relates to Iranian aggression. And with that, I continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree Iran is a malign influence in the Middle East, but that doesn't mean the administration gets to bypass Congress in selling arms to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And I now would like to yield 1 minute to Chairman Smith.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. And I respect the gentleman's point about how we need to work towards an agreement to how Congress can have the most constructive role possible on arms sales. The concern here is the tendency of to declare an emergency when they simply want to do something that we haven't allowed them to do is troubling, because it takes us out of the process. So we need to find a way to make sure that they can't do that. And then it's not a huge mystery why these arms sales have been held up. We are concerned about Iran's malign influence. We are also concerned about the actions that Saudi Arabia has been taking in that region that could be stirring up conflict and making it easier for Iran to have that malign influence, but quite specifically, killing civilians in Yemen in a way that generate sympathy. Certainly for the Houthis in Yemen, but then sympathy for that side. So we are worried about the way Saudi Arabia is conducting this war, certainly, and we're also worried about other actions by Saudi Arabia. Certainly the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi has not been answered for to this point. So simply selling weapons to Saudi Arabia at this point is something that is going to take time and is going to raise questions. And for the President to simply bypass us, taking us out of the process in that situation, I think undermines our role. That's the purpose of this amendment, and I urge adoption.
Gentleman from California's reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also think it's important to note that the United States is not engaged in direct hostilities in Yemen. We stopped the refueling of Saudi aircraft. So the activities have actually, in many respects, have been walked back from what was historically known as being directly engaged in hostilities on the ground, which is just not the case here as it relates to the United States. I continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California.
Thank you. This issue has bipartisan support, and I request and I vote on the amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, I would urge all of my colleagues to oppose this amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The question is on the